Story number 1. The Lullaby Beneath Lake Clark. Lake Clark is a place of stark, unyielding beauty. In winter, the lake transforms into an expanse of ice and snow so vast and pristine it feels untouched by time. The silence there is absolute, broken only by the occasional crack of shifting ice or the whistle of the wind threading through the surrounding mountains. It was that quiet, that perfect isolation, which drew me and my friends to its frozen surface for a weekend of backcountry skiing and camping. We were four: myself, my brother Daniel, and our friends Sarah and Mike, experienced outdoors people. We'd tackled Alaska's wilderness many times before. Lake Clark was supposed to be another adventure, a challenging trek across its frozen surface, nights spent under a dome of stars, and stories shared around the warmth of a campfire. But by the end of our first night on the lake, any thought of adventure had given way to something far darker. It started with the singing. The day had been long but satisfying. A steady traverse across the lake's frozen expanse with clear skies and manageable cold. By dusk, we'd pitched our tents near the center of the lake, a spot chosen for its view of the surrounding mountains. The sky was a breathtaking gradient of deep purples and fiery oranges, and for a moment, we felt the peace we had come seeking. Dinner was quick, a mix of dehydrated meals and energy bars eaten around a modest fire. The conversation was light, filled with laughter and banter, until the fire began to die down and we retired to our tents. The wind picked up as the night deepened, carrying with it a strange, mournful sound that I initially dismissed as the groaning of the ice. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, straining to hear over the wind, I realized it wasn't the ice at all. It was a voice, faint, melodic, and impossibly distant. It rose and fell like a lullaby carried through water. I sat up, listening intently, my pulse quickening as the sound grew clearer. It was beautiful in an eerie, unsettling way, the kind of melody that seems to wrap itself around your thoughts and pull you under. "Do you hear that?" I asked, unzipping my tent and poking my head out into the cold. Daniel was already outside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "It sounds like singing." Sarah and Mike emerged moments later, both of them wide-eyed and tense. The four of us stood together in the biting cold, straining to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the ice beneath our feet. "Weird acoustics," Mike said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe the wind." But it wasn't the wind. Compelled by curiosity, and perhaps something else, we grabbed our headlamps and approached the edge of the campsite, where the ice was clear enough to see through. The light from our lamps penetrated the surface, illuminating the dark water below. First, all we saw was emptiness, a void that stretched endlessly beneath the ice. But then they appeared. Shadows. They moved slowly, deliberately, their forms distorted by the rippling water. First, I thought they were fish or some other aquatic creatures, but as the shapes drew closer, it became clear they were humanoid. Their limbs were elongated, their movements languid but purposeful, as though they were swimming just beneath the ice's surface. "Is this some kind of trick?" Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Who the hell would be under the ice?" Daniel replied, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. None of us had an answer. We watched in stunned silence as the figures continued to drift beneath the ice, their forms flickering in and out of focus like shadows cast by a dying flame. And then, one of them stopped directly beneath us, turned its face upward. Though distorted by the ice, its features were unmistakable. Hollow eyes stared back at me, their emptiness consuming. Its mouth moved slowly, forming words we couldn't hear but somehow felt. And then the ice beneath my feet trembled, a faint vibration that sent a jolt of panic through my body. "I think it's moving," I said, my voice shaking. "The ice." Before I could finish, Sarah gasped and stepped back, clutching her arm as if she'd been burned. "Something touched me," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Something's under the ice." Mike grabbed her, pulling her away from the edge as Daniel and I scanned the area with our lights. The figures had vanished, leaving only the black, featureless water below. But the singing remained, louder now, and more insistent. It wasn't a lullaby anymore. It was a call. We retreated to the campsite, our breaths coming fast and shallow, our minds racing. No one suggested leaving, we were too far from the shore, and traveling in the dark was suicide. But staying meant enduring the night with whatever was beneath the ice. I heard it call my name, Daniel said suddenly, breaking the silence. We all turned to him, our faces pale in the firelight. What? I asked. When we were looking down, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I swear I heard it. My name, clear as day. None of us knew what to say. We sat in silence, the fire crackling weakly, until the singing began again. This time, it was closer, louder. It seemed to rise up from beneath us, vibrating through the ice and into the air, surrounding us in a cocoon of sound. And then came the knocking. It started faintly, like the tapping of fingers against glass, but grew louder and more forceful, echoing from the ice beneath our feet. The ground trembled with each strike, the vibrations coursing through my body like an electric current. Mike grabbed an ice axe, his knuckles white as he gripped it. This isn't happening, he muttered, his eyes darting around the campsite. But it was. The knocking grew into a cacophony, joined by the sound of the singing, which had turned into a wailing cry that seemed to rise from the depths of the lake. And then, all at once, it stopped. The silence was deafening. We didn't sleep. We sat huddled together, our eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. When dawn finally broke, we packed up in frantic silence and began the trek back to shore. None of us spoke about what we had seen or heard, each of us desperate to leave the lake behind. When we reached the safety of the forest, I glanced back at the vast expanse of ice. In the distance, near where we had camped, I saw them again, shadows moving beneath the surface, slow and deliberate, as though watching us leave. I haven't returned to Lake Clark since that night, though its memory lingers in my mind like a stain. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear the singing again, faint and insistent, calling to me from some unseen depth. I try to ignore it, but deep down, I know it's not over. The lake remembers, and so do I. Story number 2. The Creature of Mount Denali. Mount Denali, with its towering peaks and unrelenting wilderness, is as majestic as it is merciless. It's a place where the beauty of nature is matched only by its danger. A realm where the thin air and biting cold conspire to remind you of your fragility. I had always been drawn to such places, seeking not just the thrill of conquest but the quiet humbling that only the mountains can provide. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered there. A terror that still haunts my dreams and calls to me in the dead of night. It was early March when my climbing partner, Jack, and I set out on a week-long expedition to scale one of Denali's lesser-traveled routes. The weather had been unusually clear for the season, giving us a rare window to attempt the ascent. Jack was a seasoned mountaineer, calm under pressure and unfazed by the challenges that often came with high-altitude climbs. I trusted him with my life, as he trusted me with his. The first few days were grueling but uneventful. The snow was deep, the air thin, and the climb relentless. We had planned each leg meticulously, pacing ourselves to avoid exhaustion while keeping an eye on the weather. The nights were cold and silent, broken only by the occasional groan of shifting ice or the distant howl of the wind. It was on the 4th day that everything changed. We had reached a narrow ridge late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the snow. The air was unnervingly still, the kind of quiet that sets your nerves on edge. As we stopped to rest, Jack froze, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I followed his gaze to a rocky outcrop about 100 yards away. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the setting sun. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, a massive figure stepped into view. The creature was covered in thick, dark fur, its body hunched but impossibly large. Its long arms hung low, almost reaching the ground, and its head turned toward us with an unnatural grace. For a moment, we locked eyes. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dying light, and a low, guttural growl rumbled through the air. Jack and I stood frozen, too terrified to move. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound that reverberated through the mountains and made the very ground beneath us tremble. Then, with a powerful leap, it disappeared into a nearby crevasse, its growls echoing long after it was gone. We didn't speak as we made our way to the next camp, our minds racing with questions we couldn't begin to answer. The creature, whatever it was, defied explanation. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. That night, we pitched our tent in a sheltered spot near a cluster of rocks, hoping they would provide some protection from the unknown. We built a small fire and tried to eat, but the tension between us was palpable. Every sound, every gust of wind or distant crack of ice, set my nerves on edge. Jack, usually so composed, was visibly shaken. What the hell was that thing? I finally asked, breaking the silence. Jack shook his head. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. The night passed in restless silence, each of us too afraid to sleep for long. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. I nudged Jack awake, and we listened in tense silence. The breathing grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be just outside the tent. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the snow. My heart pounded as a shadow passed over the tent, its outline massive and otherworldly. Jack reached for his ice axe, his hands trembling, but neither of us dared to move. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and purposeful, as if the creature were inspecting us. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone, its heavy strides fading into the distance. When dawn broke, we emerged cautiously from the tent, our breaths visible in the frigid air. The snow around the tent was marked by enormous footprints, each one twice the size of a human's and pressed deep into the snow. They circled the tent in a perfect loop before leading off toward the crevasse where we had first seen the creature. We need to get out of here, Jack said, his voice firm but unsteady. Now. I didn't argue. We packed our gear as quickly as our numb fingers would allow, abandoning any thought of continuing the climb. The mountain no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like a predator, watching and waiting. The descent was a blur of exhaustion and fear. Every shadow, every gust of wind felt like a threat. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, we were too tired to speak, our minds consumed by what we had seen and heard. We reported the encounter to the park rangers, hoping for some explanation, but they dismissed it as a bear sighting or a hallucination brought on by altitude sickness. We knew better. The footprints, the growls, the sheer presence of the creature, none of it fit any explanation they offered. Months have passed since that expedition, but the memory remains vivid, a scar on my mind that refuses to fade. I often find myself staring at maps of Denali, my eyes drawn to the area where we saw the creature. Part of me wants to return, to seek answers, to confront the thing that haunts my dreams. But another part of me knows that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the growl again, low, guttural, and impossibly close. It echoes in my mind, a reminder of the creature that still roams Mount Denali, watching, waiting, and claiming its place in the endless wilderness. Story number 3. Laughter in the dark at Hatcher Pass. Hatcher Pass, nestled in the heart of Alaska, is a place of haunting beauty. Snow-covered peaks rise like silent sentinels over vast stretches of wilderness. And the air is so crisp it feels like it could cut glass. For those seeking solitude and adventure, it's a paradise. But like many places in Alaska, it has its shadows. Its stories whispered around campfires or passed down by locals who know better than to linger after dark. I never believed in those stories until the night we stayed in the house. It was supposed to be a simple trip. My friends and I, Sam, Eric, Mia, and Jake, had planned a weekend of backcountry skiing in the pristine powder of Hatcher Pass. The weather forecast was promising, and we were well prepared with gear, supplies, and enough layers to face the harshest conditions. We set out early, the snow crunching under our skis, the mountains towering around us in stoic silence. By late afternoon, we'd covered a good distance and decided to find shelter for the night. That's when we saw it, alone. Weather-beaten house standing against the snowy expanse, its dark silhouette stark against the white landscape. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the roof sagging under the weight of countless winters, the windows clouded with frost. But it was shelter, and with the sun sinking behind the mountains, we didn't have the luxury of being picky. The house was colder inside than out, the air thick with the scent of decay and something metallic. The walls were bare, the floorboards warped and creaking under our weight. Snow had drifted in through cracks in the walls, piling in corners like ghostly sentinels. It was clear no one had lived here in a long time, yet the place felt occupied, not by people, but by something else, something unseen. Creepy, Mia muttered, pulling her jacket tighter. But it'll do. We set up camp in the main room, a large space with a stone fireplace that had long since gone cold. Sam and Jake managed to start a small fire using wood we'd found in a pile by the hearth, though it smoked more than it burned. We laid out our sleeping bags, ate a quick meal, and tried to ignore the oppressive silence that seemed to press in from every direction. As the night deepened, the wind picked up, howling around the house like a living thing. The windows rattled in their frames, and the fire flickered as if threatened by an unseen force. We were huddled around the fading warmth, sharing stories to pass the time. When it happened, a laugh. It started softly, almost a chuckle, but it rose quickly, filling the room with a sound that was both human and utterly wrong. It came from above us, from the second floor, where none of us had dared to venture. "Did you hear that?" Eric asked, his voice a whisper. We nodded, our faces pale in the firelight. The laughter had stopped, leaving behind a suffocating silence that was somehow worse. Jake, always the brave one or the reckless one, grabbed a flashlight and stood. "I'm checking it out," he said. "Don't," Mia pleaded, her eyes wide. "It's not worth it." But Jake was already moving toward the stairs, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Reluctantly, Sam and I followed, leaving Mia and Eric by the fire. The stairs groaned under our weight, each step a protest against our intrusion. The second floor was colder than the first, the air so frigid it burned my lungs. Our breaths hung in the air, faint clouds that dissolved into the shadows. The hallway was empty, the floorboards warped and dust-covered. But on one of the frost-covered windows, we saw them, handprints. They were small, childlike, and impossibly clear, as though someone had pressed their icy fingers against the glass just moments before. "What the hell?" Sam whispered, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. And then we saw the writing. It was scrawled on the wall in what looked like soot or ash. The words jagged and uneven. "Let me in." We didn't stay to investigate further. The three of us bolted down the stairs, our footsteps a chaotic drumbeat against the wooden planks. Mia and Eric looked up in alarm as we burst into the room. "What happened?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "Someone's been here," Jake said, his face pale. "There are handprints on the windows and writing." "Writing?" Eric asked. It said, "Let me in," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The fire sputtered, the shadows in the room seeming to grow darker. The wind outside howled louder, and for a moment, I thought I heard it again. That laughter, faint and mocking, carried on the wind like a cruel whisper. We agreed to leave at first light, none of us willing to stay in the house a moment longer than necessary. But the night had other plans. As the hours dragged on, the atmosphere grew heavier, the silence broken only by the wind and the occasional creak of the house settling, or so we told ourselves. Then came the footsteps. They started softly, a faint tapping from the floor above, but they grew louder, more deliberate, until it sounded as though someone or something was pacing back and forth directly over our heads. Mia clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "This isn't happening," she whispered. Jake grabbed an ice axe, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. "If someone's up there, they're going to regret it." "Don't," I said, blocking his path. "Whatever's up there, it's not human." The footsteps stopped, replaced by a new sound. Scratching came from the walls, the windows, even the floor beneath us, as though countless hands were clawing to get inside. And then, above the cacophony, the laughter returned, louder, more sinister, echoing through the house like a taunt. We didn't wait for morning. Grabbing our gear, we fled into the storm, the howling wind and blinding snow somehow less terrifying than what we had left behind. The laughter followed us, faint but persistent, until we were well beyond the house and descending into the valley. When we finally reached safety, we tried to make sense of what had happened. None of us could explain the handprints, the writing, or the laughter. The locals we told about the house only nodded grimly, their faces dark with understanding. "That place has been abandoned for decades," one of them said. "People who go there, they don't always come back." I've tried to forget what happened that night, but the memories linger like a shadow, creeping into my thoughts when I least expect it. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear faint laughter, as though it's carried on a distant wind. And on cold, frosty nights, I've woken to find handprints on my windows, small, childlike, and impossibly clear. Story number 4. The Stranger in the Snowstorm. Eagle Summit is a place of brutal beauty, a remote pass in Alaska where the mountains seem to scrape the sky, and the snow stretches endlessly, unbroken except for the occasional trail left by those brave or foolish enough to traverse it. I had heard the stories about the summit, how the wind could howl like a living thing, how the snow could blind even the most seasoned outdoorsman, how people vanished in its grasp without a trace. But I was no stranger to the wilderness, and I had always dismissed such tales as the exaggerated fears of the inexperienced. That was before I crossed Eagle Summit alone, before I met the stranger in the snowstorm. It was late February, and I was 3 days into a solo backcountry skiing trip. The weather had been kind so far, with crisp, clear skies and temperatures cold enough to keep the snow powdery but manageable. My goal was to make it through the summit and down into the valley below before the next storm system rolled in. The forecast had given me a narrow window, but I was confident I could make it. The first signs of trouble came late in the afternoon. The wind picked up, biting and sharp, and the clear skies began to cloud over with alarming speed. By the time I reached the base of the summit, the light had started to fade, and a fine, swirling snow filled the air. I debated turning back, but the thought of losing a day's progress and the challenge of the summit itself spurred me on. I tightened my jacket, adjusted my goggles, and began the ascent. The climb was grueling. The wind screamed through the pass, carrying stinging ice particles that cut through my layers. The visibility dropped to almost nothing, the world around me reduced to a shifting void of white. I focused on the rhythmic motion of my skis, the crunch of snow beneath them, the steady pace I had set. It was exhausting, but it was all I could do to keep moving forward. And then, through the swirling snow, I saw it. First, I thought it was a tree, though the summit was well above the treeline. A dark shape stood out against the blizzard, motionless, almost indistinct. As I drew closer, it took on the unmistakable form of a person. They were standing perfectly still, facing in my direction, their features obscured by the storm. But what struck me immediately was their lack of proper clothing. They weren't wearing a jacket, gloves, or even a hat, just a thin shirt and pants that clung to their form like frostbitten skin. "Hey!" I called out, my voice muffled by the wind. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. They didn't move at all, not even a shiver in the brutal cold. I pushed forward, my skis crunching over the ice, determined to reach them and offer help. But as I approached, they seemed to shift, their edges blurring as if they were dissolving into the snow itself. By the time I was within a few yards, they were gone. I stopped, my heart pounding, my breath visible in ragged clouds. The spot where the figure had stood was empty, the snow unbroken except for my own tracks. I scanned the storm for any sign of them, calling out into the void. But the only answer was the relentless howl of the wind. A deep unease settled over me, but I tried to shake it off. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the storm. Perhaps the cold and fatigue were playing tricks on my mind. I pressed on, my movements faster now, driven by a growing need to put distance between myself and whatever I had just seen. The storm intensified, the wind pushing against me as if trying to force me back. The summit felt endless, the landscape around me featureless and oppressive. I began to feel as though I were skiing in circles, the scenery repeating itself in a maddening loop. It wasn't until I stopped to catch my breath that I realized the truth. I glanced down at my tracks, hoping to reassure myself that I was making progress. Instead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My tracks didn't lead forward, they led back. Back to where I had come from. Back to the spot where I had first seen the figure. Panic set in. I turned around, retracing the tracks in disbelief. The storm swirled around me, the wind carrying faint, indistinct whispers that seemed to come from every direction. The harder I tried to focus on the sounds, the less they made sense. A chaotic mix of voices that ebbed and flowed like the gusts of wind. I clenched my teeth and pushed forward, desperate to escape the endless white void that seemed to be closing in on me. And then I saw them again. The figure was standing exactly where they had been before, in the same unnerving stillness, their gaze fixed on me. I stopped in my tracks, fear paralyzing me. This time, I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just stared, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward me with a slow, deliberate motion, and then, without a sound, they dissolved into the wind once more. I turned and fled, my skis skimming over the snow as fast as I could manage. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, overlapping until they formed a single, chilling phrase, "Turn back." The words seemed to press against my skull, invading my thoughts until I couldn't think of anything else. My breath came in short gasps, my body screaming for rest, but I didn't dare stop. I skied blindly through the storm, no longer caring where I ended up, as long as it was away from that place. When I finally collapsed, exhausted and shaking, the storm had begun to ease. The wind died down, the snow settling into a gentle fall. I looked around, disoriented but relieved to find no sign of the figure. My tracks stretched behind me, a chaotic path that bore no resemblance to the neat lines I had started with. I didn't know where I was, but I didn't care. All that mattered was that I had escaped. I made it off the summit the next day, though the experience left me shaken. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen, afraid they would dismiss me as delirious from the cold. But even now, months later, I can't forget the figure in the storm, their stillness, their gaze, the way they dissolved into nothingness. I can't forget the whispers, the way they seemed to know me, to warn me, to trap me. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of my home, I swear I can still hear them. Turn back. The words echo in my mind, a chilling reminder of the stranger in the snowstorm, a reminder that some places are not meant to be crossed, and some mysteries are better left untouched. Story number 5. The Red Tent on Columbia Glacier. The Columbia Glacier is a place of haunting beauty, a sprawling expanse of ice and snow that stretches as far as the eye can see. Its stark white landscape is broken only by jagged peaks and deep crevasses, a frozen wilderness that feels untouched by time. It's a place that commands respect and fear. I had heard the stories, whispered among mountaineers and guides, about strange occurrences on the glacier, lights in the distance, voices carried on the wind, shadows moving where there should be none. But like most tales, I dismissed them as folklore. That was before I found myself standing in front of the Red Tent. It was late February, and our group had embarked on a week-long backcountry skiing expedition across the glacier. There were 5 of us: myself, my best friend Eric, a couple named Nina and Paul, and our guide, a seasoned mountaineer named Tom. The weather had been perfect for days: crisp, clear skies, and a biting cold that kept the snow dry and powdery. We had made good progress, setting up camp each night in the shadow of towering ice formations that shimmered under the moonlight. On the 4th day, as we made our way across a particularly desolate stretch of the glacier, we saw it. At first, it looked like a speck of blood against the endless white, a stark and jarring color that didn't belong. As we drew closer, it took shape: a small red tent, its fabric taut against the wind, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. "Is someone else out here?" Nina asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. Tom frowned, his brows knitting together. "Unlikely. We're miles from any other groups, and this area isn't a common route." We approached cautiously, the crunch of our skis against the snow the only sound. The tent was ordinary enough, weathered but sturdy, the sky lines secured tightly in the ice. But what struck me was the stillness. There were no tracks leading to or from the tent, no sign of movement, as though it had simply appeared. Tom unzipped the flap and peered inside. "Empty," he said, stepping aside so we could see for ourselves. The interior was small but surprisingly tidy. A sleeping bag was rolled neatly in one corner, and a small stove sat on the ground, a pot of water still steaming faintly atop it. "It's like someone just left," Paul said, running a gloved hand over the stove. "This is still warm." "But where are they?" Nina asked, looking around at the unbroken snow. We stood in silence, the weight of the situation sinking in. Whoever had been here couldn't have gone far. Yet there was no sign of them. It was as if the glacier itself had swallowed them whole. As we debated what to do, Tom noticed something: a set of footprints leading away from the tent, barely visible in the shifting snow. They were faint but unmistakable, heading toward the edge of the glacier where it dropped into a vast expanse of jagged ice and deep crevasses. "Let's follow them," Eric said, his adventurous spirit undeterred by the eerie circumstances. Tom hesitated, clearly uneasy. "We need to be careful. The glacier can be unpredictable, and we're not equipped for rescue." Despite his reservations, we set off, following the trail of footprints. The wind picked up as we moved, carrying with it a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo across the ice. The footprints led us to the edge of a massive crevasse, its opening dark and foreboding. We stopped, peering down into the abyss. The wind howled through the chasm, its pitch shifting until it sounded almost human, like a voice whispering from the depths. "Do you hear that?" Nina asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. We nodded, each of us hearing the same thing: a faint, raspy whisper that seemed to say, "Turn back." A chill ran down my spine, and not just from the cold. Tom shook his head, his face pale. "We shouldn't be here. Let's head back to camp." But Eric, ever the thrill-seeker, knelt near the edge, shining his headlamp into the crevasse. "There's something down there," he said. "I think I see movement." "Eric, don't," I shouted, my voice trembling. Before we could stop him, he slipped a harness from his pack and began securing it to a nearby ice screw. "I just want to take a quick look," he said, flashing us a grin that did nothing to hide his nerves. Tom grabbed his arm. This isn't a game. If you go down there, I can't guarantee we can get you back. But Eric was determined. Against our better judgment, we helped him lower himself into the crevasse. The rope taut as he descended into the shadows. For a moment, all we could hear was the scrape of his crampons against the ice and his labored breathing over the radio. Then the breathing stopped. "Eric," I called, gripping the radio tightly. "What's going on? Are you okay?" There was no response, just static. And then, faintly, the whispering. It was louder now, more distinct, as though it were coming from the radio itself. "Turn back. Leave this place." Tom began pulling the rope up, his movements frantic. When Eric emerged from the crevasse, his face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. He collapsed onto the snow, shaking uncontrollably. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside him. It's not empty down there," he stammered. I saw faces. They were in the ice, looking at me, and I swear they moved." The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to say. Tom made the call to return to camp immediately, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a palpable sense of urgency. That night, none of us slept. The wind howled outside, rattling the walls of our tent and carrying with it the same haunting whispers we'd heard at the crevasse. Eric sat in silence, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Nina and Paul huddled together, their expressions mirroring the fear we all felt. At some point during the night, I thought I heard movement outside, a faint crunch of snow, followed by the soft rustle of fabric. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sounds faded, leaving only the wind. In the morning, we found the red tent gone. No trace of it remained, as though it had never been there. The footprints leading to the crevasse were also gone, erased by the night's wind. But near our camp, we found something that hadn't been there before. A single set of footprints, leading away from the tent and disappearing into the distance. We left the glacier that day, cutting our expedition short. None of us spoke of what we had seen or heard, each of us desperate to leave the Columbia Glacier behind. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that we were followed off the ice, that something ancient and malevolent watched us as we fled. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the wind outside my window. It whispers to me, faint and insistent, the same words we heard on the glacier: "Turn back." And in my dreams, I see the red tent, standing alone in the endless white, waiting for its next visitors.